For 25 years, a quiet man in a gray cap ate breakfast at the same roadside stall on the old highway west of Albuquerque. Same stool. Same order. A green chili breakfast burrito, extra hot, and a black coffee. He came a handful of times a year, whenever he was passing through, and he always left a $100 bill on a $6 check, and he always asked the old woman who ran the stand about her grandchildren by name. She never knew who he was. Not really. To her, he was just a kind man who liked her green chili and never stayed long. And then, one spring, he stopped coming. She waited. She kept his stool clear out of habit, then out of hope, then out of something she couldn't name. Months went by, and the man in the gray cap never came back, and the old woman worried the way you worry about anyone who was part of the shape of your days, and then simply wasn't. She only found out why he'd been coming, for 25 years, all that way, to a roadside stall he could have driven past 10,000 times, after he was already gone. And when she found out, an old woman who had cooked breakfast on the same corner for 4 decades had to sit down on an overturned milk crate behind her own stand, because her legs would not hold her. There is a stretch of the old road west of Albuquerque, New Mexico, Route 66, the real one, the 2-lane the interstate replaced, where the town thins out and the mesa opens up, and the light in the morning comes across the sand the color of a struck match. And on a corner out there, where a gravel turnout meets the old highway, there has stood for 42 years a small food stand with a hand-painted sign that says, simply, Estella's. It is not much to look at. A plywood counter under a corrugated awning, 4 stools bolted to the ground, a griddle, a coffee urn, a cooler, and a pot of green chile that has, by any honest reckoning, been the best green chile in that county for 4 decades. There are folding tables in the gravel for the weekend menudo crowd. There is a string of chile ristras drying on a nail. There is a coffee can by the register with a slot cut in the lid, for the church, for whoever needs it. The woman who ran it was named Estella Misquez, and by the time this story happened, she was 74 years old and had been standing at that griddle since before most of her regulars were born. Into that stand, on a warm morning about 30 years back, a starving 21-year-old drove a dying Buick with $2 in his pocket. His name was Marcus Rourke, but nobody knew that yet. Least of all him, because he was not yet anybody. He was a foster kid who had aged out of the system at 18 with a garbage bag of clothes and no people in the world. And he had spent 3 years working and saving and dreaming, and he had finally pointed a car he'd bought for $400 toward Los Angeles to chase a thing he barely dared to say out loud. He was going to be an actor. He had $110, a quarter tank of gas, and a certainty that everyone who loved him, a very short list, thought he was a fool. The Buick died just past Estella's corner. And Marcus Rourke, who had not eaten in 2 days because gas mattered more than food, coasted onto the gravel turnout, put his head on the steering wheel, and, for the first time since he was a small boy, allowed himself to cry because he was out of money and out of road, and about 1,100 miles short of the only dream he had. He did not know it, but he had broken down in the exact right place. He had broken down in front of Estella. To understand what happened next, you have to understand who Estella Misquez was, because she was not a saint, and she did not have money to give away, and she fed a starving stranger anyway. And the reason she did it is the whole quiet engine of this story. Estella had come north from a small town in Chihuahua at 19, alone, with a cardboard suitcase and an address for a cousin who had already moved on by the time she arrived. She knew what it was to be hungry in a place where no one knew your name. She had spent her first winter in this country, washing dishes for a man who paid her half what he'd promised. And she had eaten, more than one night, from what other people left on their plates. And she had sworn the specific, unshakable oath of a person who has been that hungry that if she ever had a kitchen of her own, no one would go hungry within reach of it. She got her kitchen. It took her 15 years of dishwashing and cleaning and saving nickels in a coffee can, and she built the stand with her late husband, Rutilio, with their own hands, and she made it exactly the kind of place she had needed and never had when she was 19 and starving in a country that didn't know her. There was a rule at Estella's, unwritten, that every regular knew and no tourist ever noticed. Nadie comes solo, y nadie se va con hambre. Nobody eats alone, and nobody leaves hungry. If you had money, you paid. If you didn't, you ate anyway, and Estella would find you something to do. Sweep, stack, peel, so you could leave with your back straight. She never made anybody beg. She had begged once herself, and she remembered exactly what it cost. So when she came out from behind her counter that morning 30 years ago and found a young man with his head on the wheel of a dead car, gaunt in the way that means real hunger and not skipped lunch, Estella Merquez did what she had built her entire life to be able to do. She knocked on his window and said, "Come, eat. You look terrible." She fed him a green chili breakfast burrito that morning, and he ate it too fast, and she watched him try not to cry into it, and she pretended not to see, and she made him a second one. She would not take his $2. When he tried to work it off, and he did try, he swept her gravel and stacked her chairs and asked for a broom before she'd even offered. She let him, because she understood that a young man that proud needed to leave with his back straight. He stayed 3 days, sleeping in the dead Buick, and Estella fed him 3 times a day and never once let him pay. And on the 4th morning her nephew got the Buick running, and Estella pressed a paper bag of 6 wrapped burritos and a $20 bill into the boy's hands and told him it was for the road and she would not hear otherwise. The boy asked her, his voice breaking, how he could ever pay her back. And Estella Merquez said the thing that this entire story turns on. She waved her hand, the way you wave off a fly, and she said, "You don't pay me back. That's not how it works. One day you'll be old and doing well, and there'll be some skinny kid with a dead car and no money, and you'll feed him, and you won't let him pay either. That's how you pay me back. You pass it down the road." Then she told him to drive safe and to eat the burritos before they went bad, and to come back sometime and tell her he'd made it. He drove west. She went back to her griddle. She fed 1,000 more people that year and did not think of the boy in the Buick as anything more than one of the many she'd fed, because to Estella it was not a remarkable thing she had done. It was just Tuesday. It was just the rule. She had no idea she had just changed the whole shape of a life. He came back the first time about 4 years later. By then a few things had happened to Marcus Rourke that would eventually happen to a great many more people's television screens. But Estella did not own a television that showed those things, and she did not go to the movies, and she would not have recognized the name if you'd said it to her. So when a young man in a gray cap pulled up on a spring morning, ordered a green chile breakfast burrito extra hot and a black coffee, and left a $50 bill on the counter, and was gone before she could make change, she thought only that some people are generous and some people are strange, and this one was maybe both. She did not connect him to the boy in the Buick. Why would she? People change enormously between 21 and 25, and she had fed 10,000 faces since, and he did not say a word about it. He just ate, and watched her cook with an expression she couldn't read, and thanked her, and left too much money, and drove off. He came back twice more that year. Then 3 or 4 times the next, and slowly, over the years, the man in the gray cap became a fixture at Estella's, not a daily regular, but a seasonal one. A man who appeared a handful of times a year, always alone, always at the counter, always the same order, always kind, always gone within the half hour. The other regulars knew him as El Callado, the quiet one. They assumed he was a trucker, or a traveling salesman, or a man with family in the area, because those were the kinds of men who turned up at a roadside stand on the old highway again and again over the years. He learned her grandchildren's names. He asked after them every single time. How is Lucia doing in school? Is Rutilio's knee better? Did Marisol have the baby? And he remembered the answers, year over year, the way you only remember things you actually care about. When Estella's husband Rutilio died, the man in the gray cap came through 2 weeks later, and he did not make a speech. He just held her weathered hand in both of his for a moment across the plywood counter and said, "He built a good place. People are going to be eating here and feeling better for 100 years. And then he ordered his burrito, and something about the ordinariness of it was the most comforting thing anyone said to her that whole terrible month. And the money. The money was always wrong in the right direction. A $100 bill on a $6 check, folded under the coffee cup where he thought she wouldn't argue with it until he was gone. Year after year. Estella tried to refuse it, the first few times, chased him to his car once, and he had said only, "Please, it makes me happy. Let me have that," and there was something in how he said it that made her stop chasing him and start, instead, quietly putting most of it into the coffee can with a slot in the lid. For the church. For whoever needed it. Passing it down the road, though she didn't know yet how right that was. There was a stretch, about 12 years in, when the county wanted her corner, a highway project, a developer, a right-of-way. The details were the kind of thing that crushes a small stand run by an old woman with no lawyer. Estella got letters she couldn't fully read and made phone calls that went nowhere and lay awake certain she was going to lose the things she and Rutilio had built with their hands. And then, one day, the letters simply stopped. The project routed around her. Somebody, somewhere, she was told vaguely, had bought the parcel and put it in some kind of trust, and her lease was now essentially permanent, and the rent was $1 a year. She assumed it was luck. She assumed it was God. She said a rosary of thanks and went back to her griddle, and never learned that the man in the gray cap had made 3 phone calls from his car in the turnout that same week she'd been lying awake. 25 years, all told. And then one spring, he stopped coming. At first, she thought he was just traveling elsewhere. He'd gone quiet before, once for almost a year. But a year passed, and then more, and the gray cap never appeared on the far stool, and Estella, who was 74 now and had buried a husband and 2 of her own brothers, and knew the particular texture of an absence that isn't coming back, began to understand, without any evidence at all, that something had happened to her quiet one. She kept his stool clear anyway. It became a small thing the regulars teased her about gently, and then stopped teasing her about. Because they saw it wasn't a joke to her. What she did not know, what she had no way of knowing, because she still did not own a television that showed such things, and did not read the entertainment pages, and had never once heard the name, was that a beloved actor named Marcus Rourke had died that spring, and that it had been on every screen in America for a week, and that hundreds of thousands of strangers had grieved a man they knew only from movies. Estella grieved too, that same spring, quietly, behind her stand, but she was grieving a kind man in a gray cap who liked her green chile, and she never once connected the two. They were, to her, different men entirely. One was a name on screens she never looked at. The other was hers. It was almost 4 months after he stopped coming that a car she didn't recognize pulled onto her gravel. A clean, quiet, expensive car, and a woman got out. Not young, calm, with kind and slightly nervous eyes, holding a leather folder. She came to the counter and ordered a green chili breakfast burrito, extra hot, and a black coffee. And when Estella set it in front of her, the woman looked at it for a long moment without eating, and her eyes filled. "He told me it was the best thing he ever ate," the woman said. "For 30 years he told me that." Estella went very still. The woman's name was Priya. She had worked for the man in the gray cap for a very long time, and she had come, she said, because there was a letter she had been instructed to deliver in person, and only when the time came. And the time had come. She set the letter on the plywood counter, and she told Estella, gently as anyone had ever told her anything, that the man in the gray cap and the famous man whose death had been on all those screens she never watched were the same person. And, before Estella could even absorb that, told her something that emptied the strength from an old woman's legs and put her down on an overturned milk crate behind her own stand. The man in the gray cap. The famous stranger, and the starving boy in the dead Buick, 30 years ago, whom she had fed for 3 days and sent down the road with a bag of burritos and $20 and one piece of advice. All three were one man. She had been feeding the same soul for 30 years and had known it only for the first 3 days. The letter was in his own hand. Priya said he'd written it years earlier and rewritten it more than once, and had left instructions that it go to Estella and to no one else. He wrote that he had broken down in front of her stand at the lowest moment of his life, with $2 and no food and no people, and a dream he was pretty sure was going to kill him. He wrote that he had been that close, and here he'd drawn 2 fingers almost touching, to turning the Buick around if it had run, and going back to nothing. Because a person can only be that alone and that hungry for so long before the dream stops being worth it. And he wrote that a woman he had never met came out of a roadside stand and knocked on his window and said, "Come, eat, you look terrible," and fed him for 3 days and would not let him pay, and told him he didn't owe her anything except to pass it down the road someday. And that he had gotten back in that car with a full stomach and 6 burritos and $20 and, for the first time in his life, the feeling that the world might contain people who would catch you. And that this feeling, more than any talent, was the thing that got him the last 1,100 miles, and then through the 10,000 miles of rejection after that, because a man who has been caught once believes he might be caught again. "You didn't just feed me," he wrote. "You proved to me that the world was not what I'd been taught it was. I built an entire life on the evidence you handed me across that counter." He wrote that he had come back, the first time, meaning to tell her, meaning to thank her, and pay her back 1,000-fold, and make a grand gesture of it. And that he had watched her cook, and watched her feed a construction crew and slip a burrito to a kid who was clearly short, and refused to make change for a tourist so she could round it down. And he had realized that a grand gesture would ruin it. That she didn't want to be paid back, she'd told him so, 30 years ago, waving her hand like she was shooing a fly. That the only way to honor what she'd done was to let her keep being who she was, and to be, for as long as he could, just a kind man in a gray cap who liked her green chili, because her corner, he wrote, was the one place left on earth where he got to be the boy in the Buick again, instead of the name on the screens. Where nobody wanted anything from him. Where an old woman asked about his day and meant it, and had no idea he was anybody at all. It was the only place I felt like a person. he wrote. For 25 years, when the noise got to be too much, I flew to Albuquerque and drove out to your corner and had a burrito and a coffee and asked about Lucia's grades. And I remembered who I was before any of it. You have no idea what you were to me. I hope this letter gives you some idea. And then he told her what he had done, plainly, the way you confess things, that the parcel her stand sat on had been his for 18 years, that he was the vague somebody who bought it and put it in a trust so that no county and no developer and no highway could ever move her off that corner, and that the trust was permanent, and that Estella's would stand at that turnout as long as anyone in her family wanted to run it, in perpetuity, rent $1 a year, forever. That Lucia's college, the granddaughter whose grades he'd asked about for 15 years, had been paid, all of it, from the first day by a scholarship fund with a name that meant nothing. That was him. And that there was, with the letter, a sum of money left directly to Estella herself, with a single instruction that she was not to spend it fixing up the stand, because the stand was perfect exactly as it was, and she was to spend it on herself, on rest, on her family, on nothing useful at all. And that if he knew her, and he did, she would put most of it in the coffee can, with a slot in the lid, and pass it down the road, and that would be all right too. He signed it, The Boy in the Buick. Thank you for catching me, M. Here's the part the story usually skips. The slow part. The true part. Estella Misquez did not close the stand. Anyone who thought a windfall would let a 74-year-old woman finally rest did not understand Estella, or the rule, or the coffee can. She kept cooking. She put most of the money, exactly as he'd predicted, into things that helped other people, and she kept the rest as a small cushion so she'd never again lie awake over a letter she couldn't read. But she changed one thing. She hung a small photograph by the register. A young man, gaunt, half smiling, leaning against a dead Buick that Priya had found and had printed for her. No name under it. The tourists never asked. The regulars learned the story slowly, the way stories move through a place like that, and they stopped teasing her about the stool she kept clear, and started, some of them, leaving a little extra in the coffee can, for the church, for whoever needed it. Passing it down the road. Lucia, the granddaughter, 19 and restless, who had spent that whole spring telling her grandmother that the stand was a dead end and the town was a trap and that she was going to leave the first chance she got and not look back. Lucia read that letter, and something in her rearranged. She had thought her grandmother's life was small. She had thought feeding the same construction crews, the same burritos, on the same corner for 40 years was the opposite of doing something with your life. And then she learned that one of those ordinary breakfasts, handed across the counter to a boy with $2, had gone on to become an entire life. And 100 quiet kindnesses her grandmother would never even hear about, radiating out for 30 years like rings on water. She understood all at once that she had been raised at the feet of a woman doing the most important work there is, and had mistaken it for nothing, because it never once asked to be seen. Lucia finished the college that a dead stranger had paid for. And then she came home. She runs Estella's now. Estella finally rests, most days, on a chair in the shade near the register, correcting the chili when it needs it, and Lucia kept every single thing the same. The plywood, the 4 stools, the coffee can, the rule. Nobody eats alone, and nobody leaves hungry. She says she is not running a restaurant. She says she is keeping a door open, the way it was kept open for a boy in a Buick, the way you never know who's coming down the road. A few times a year, someone finds the corner on purpose now. The story got out, the way stories do, And every so often a person will drive the old two-lane out past the edge of town and order a green chili breakfast burrito, extra hot, and a black coffee, and eat it at the counter, and leave more money than the check, and look for a while at the photograph by the register of a young man leaning on a dead car. They don't stay long. They just wanted to eat where he ate. Estella always knows them by their faces, and she always says the same thing when they go. Drive safe, she tells them. And feed somebody down the road. I have told a lot of stories on this channel, but I keep coming back to this one, and I've thought a long time about why, and I don't think it's the letter, or the trust, or the scholarship, or any of the enormous quiet things he did for her from the shadows. Those are extraordinary, and they'd be enough. But that's not the part I keep. The part I keep is 25 years of burritos. It's that he could have paid her back in a single afternoon, could have handed her a check and a photographer and a plaque and been done with the debt forever. And instead he chose to owe her, quietly, for a quarter of a century, showing up a few times a year to sit at a plywood counter and ask about a girl named Lucia's grades, because he understood something most of us never learn, that some kindnesses can't be repaid, only continued. That the woman didn't want to be thanked. She wanted to be joined, to keep being who she was, with him coming down the road to be caught by it, again and again, for the rest of his life. So here's the question the story left me with, and I don't have a clean answer for it. There is almost certainly, somewhere in your past, an Estella. Someone who caught you when you were the boy in the Buick, who did a thing so ordinary to them and so enormous to you that they've probably forgotten it entirely. And the debt is real, and it can't be paid, and the only question is whether you'll spend your life pretending you don't owe it, or whether you'll do what he did, keep coming back to that corner, in whatever form your corner takes, and pass it down the road until you're gone. Would I? Would you? Honestly, I'm not sure. Most of us aren't sure. But there's an old woman on a two-lane highway who fed a stranger on a Tuesday and never gave it another thought, and it turned into 30 years of quiet grace flowing back to her from a man she thought she barely knew. Maybe that's the thing to carry off that corner, that you never, ever know which ordinary kindness is the one that catches an entire life. This story is fictional, inspired by the quiet kind of decency the best people are known for, the kind that spends 25 years saying thank you and never once says the words. If it got to you, do me a favor down in the comments. Don't just say great story. Tell me about your Estella, the person who caught you when you were hungry and alone, who probably has no idea what they did. Say their name here. Let's thank them out loud, even the ones who'll never see it. I read every one. They're the best part of this. And if you know someone who's been quietly catching people for years with nobody thanking them, send them this. It might be the exact thing they need to hear today. If you're new here, subscribe. There's another story coming, and I'd be glad to have you for it. See you in the next one.